If you're a middle-aged person in the United States, you probably grew up thinking of American federal intel agencies and law enforcement agencies like the FBI as basically good institutions, and the people who criticize them as fundamentally anti-American. Why would you be criticizing the CIA, for example, when the CIA protects us from foreign enemies and brings vitally needed intelligence to the people who make our policies, of course. So if you're against CIA and against FBI, you're probably against the United States. And then a lot of things happen that may have started to change your mind, maybe slowly at first. 9/11, the consolidation, the streamlining, and the massive enlargement of these agencies, because we needed to do that to protect ourselves. They became a lot more powerful than they had been before 9/11. But maybe you weren't paying attention. But by the time we got to 2016, and it was very clear that the CIA, for example, was not just aimed outward at our enemies, but aimed inward at our citizens, that may have changed your mind pretty completely and forever, and for good reason. The CIA is not a force for democracy at this point at all. In fact, you can't have a democracy in a country where some of the biggest decisions are made by unelected federal employees in an agency whose budget you're not allowed to know, in secrecy. No democracy possible in a country like that. So the CIA, while it clearly performs services that are needed, is also a force for evil in this country. There's no other way to say it. But what exactly does that mean? What does the CIA do? What does it look like if you work there? What's the vantage from inside? Well, it might be worth talking to someone who's experienced that for almost 20 years, and today we are. Pedro Israel Orta is a retired CIA officer, done a lot of other things too. His family came here fleeing tyranny in Cuba, so he went into government service with the highest possible ideals and hopes and exited with something else. He's the author of the book, The Broken Whistle, A Deep State Run Amok, and we're happy to have him with us today. Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Orta. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker, for this opportunity.
Oh my gosh, of course. So I thought it might just be interesting to hear your story. Like, how did you wind up at CIA? Where are you from? What were your assumptions going in?
I managed to finish my university studies a little late in life, early 30s, and I studied international relations, political science. I've always been interested in all matters related to defense, intelligence,
Yes,
the foreign policy growing up in Miami in the 70s, the 80s, the Sandinistas, the Contra Wars,
yes.
so forth. So when I graduated from FIU, Florida International University, while there, I was recruited by the CIA.
I'm sorry to ask you to pause. What were you doing before then? Why did you take till your 30s to graduate college?
I had to work my way in Miami. My family came from Cuba with basically nothing. They started from zero. So my parents didn't have the money or means to send me to college. So I ended up going into the workforce, working in the Miami business field. And after so many years of working, it was hard work being an outdoor salesperson, knocking on doors, doing perishable commodities, grocery products. I worked a lot of hours. I managed to get my Associate of Arts degree. I graduated high school 85, got my Associate of Arts degree 1989. But from 89 to 96, it was just a lot of hard work. So finally I was able to do a massive change in my life. I basically said I cannot continue going down this route of outdoor sales. So I went into the indoor sales field with a job that was near the university. So I would go into work early in the morning, like 7 a.m., and get out of work like 4 p.m., run to the university, take classes from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. I did that for 3 years. I finally got my Bachelor of Arts, summa cum laude graduate, political science, international relations. And that's how it all started with the CIA.
Well, that's the most virtuous possible path, obviously. How were you recruited by CIA? How does that work?
They would have events at the universities. Staff officers would come down to the university, make a presentation. In this particular case, it was the Directorate of Intelligence, or Intelligence Analysis. So basically, you hear the presentation, you sign up to be interviewed. And I went to an interview. I impressed the two individuals. And, within 2 weeks, I had basically a conditional offer to be a graduate fellow pending the background investigation. So that process took like 7 months. I finally received the offer that, yes, you've been accepted. You can come in as a graduate fellow. So at that point in time, I moved up to D.C., concurrently going to George Washington University to study for a Master of Arts in Security Policy Studies. And same scenario. I was basically working almost full time. At one point, 40 hours a week, then 32 hours a week, and then back to 40 hours a week and going basically to graduate school on a full-time basis to earn my Master of Arts in Security Policy Studies, and converted that graduate fellow into a full-time CIA staff officer position.
So what did you do for CIA?
I started working in the analysis field as a certified career analyst, program analyst, where I was trained to do analysis, and I was basically the lead analyst doing counter-drug analysis for Central America and the Caribbean. I did that for almost 4 years.
And pardon my ignorance, what does that consist of? What's your day look like? What do you do at work?
This particular time, it was right immediately after post 9/11. Can you imagine Caribbean, Central America was really not a priority?
No.
So, I mean, our intelligence sources, information coming in was sparse. So I had to use a lot of my business skills, networking, working with DEA, the Department of State, different offices, to find additional sources of information to supplant that with whatever we were getting from traditional sources.
Yes.
And it was just a lot of kind of research and investigatory type skills, trying to just find pieces of information to find out what exactly is going on with the drug trafficking in Central America and the Caribbean. And we would take all that information and turn it into a finished intelligence product to inform senior executives, such as, cabinet secretaries, the president himself through President's Daily Brief. And it's just a daily routine of just lots of reading, lots of research, phone calls, having meetings, just constantly.
So you're trying to figure out how narcotics are coming in the United States, and, who's doing this,
exactly.
How are they doing it?
Who's doing it, how they're doing it, where they're going. We're looking at, okay, what were the trafficking lines?
Yeah.
Where are traffickers basically going with their drugs? Back then, during this particular time from early 2000s, the Pacific coast was big. So there are a lot of boats leaving the west coast of upper South America, kind of the Colombian Pacific coast,
yes,
going up to Central America and to Mexico. But at the same time, during that time, we still had some drug traffic in the Eastern Caribbean, and also the Caribbean side of Central America. And we were constantly just monitoring, trying to determine exactly when and where, and who, what, when, so forth, to be able to inform so that they can take it into actionable intelligence for interdiction operations, or for that matter, for the president and his cabinet secretaries to use as leverage with different nations in Central America, Mexico, so forth.
Wow. So you do that for 4 years. What do you do next?
Well, what happened then was I had enough of the analysis branch. I had worked outdoor sales. I like the business, the networking, the people contact.
Yeah.
Being glued on the computer screens for so long, it's like I had enough.
Yeah.
Especially after going to school for 3 years at FIU, 2 years at George Washington. So I volunteered to go to Iraq. Back then, we had the Iraq War, 2003, 2004. So at that point in time, it's like, this is a great opportunity for me to serve my country, do good. I know I can go out there and serve our interest. So I went out on what's known as a short-term TDY, and managed to turn that into a full-time position out there. And I did 2 years in Iraq. For 2 years, we did take breaks. They gave us typically 3-week breaks 3 times a year. So that kind of broke it up. But we would work 2, 3, 4 months without a day off. Constantly, 80 hours a week plus. I was actually on call 24/7. I went out there and I worked in the capacity where I work with senior station leadership, working with senior military officials and other government agencies, doing a lot of liaison work, basically representing the CIA to these other entities and these other entities representing them to the CIA. A lot of deconfliction, making sure we're not crossing paths, making sure that our operations are not basically overlapping each other, working on life and death issues. If somebody's life is in danger, immediately call the military, get a quick response team out there to rescue people. Many different little things.
How big was the CIA presence in Iraq when you were there?
Well, that I can't discuss, but it was a huge footprint. That I can say.
Huge footprint.
It's significant. It was probably the largest station in the world at that point. And probably not only that, but it was the largest at that point.
And it wasn't just gathering intelligence or deconflicting with other federal agencies. It's also taking a more active role, correct?
Well, back then, during the early 2000s there in Iraq, 2004, 2006, you had the Shia uprising, and you still had the Sunnis who were rebelling against the U.S. invasion. So we were basically being attacked by two different sides. On the west, the Sunnis were trying to destabilize Anbar and not allow, the coalition forces to establish a fully functioning democracy in Iraq. And then Baghdad and other areas, you had the Shias who were trying to finally, for the first time, implant their will on the government because they had been repressed for so many years. And keep in mind, you now had also the Kurds on the north. So you had a balancing act of balancing the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis. And it was a disastrous situation.
Yeah.
It was essentially a no-win situation. And it was obvious to everyone that the Shias will win the presidential elections and even the parliament. But thankfully, the Kurds were strong enough to offer enough of a counterbalance. And all government operations in the country had to deal with all three of those. Counterinsurgency operations against the Sunnis, counterinsurgency to a degree against the Shias, all the political, factions, and then managing the Kurds, keeping the Kurds happy, because the Kurds wanted to pull out and form their own country.
Of course they did, and they effectively did anyway, right? But so you're there for 4 years.
I was in Iraq for 2 years.
Rather.
Yeah. At that point in time, after Iraq, I managed to get another assignment that would give me the Department of Operations Officer Certification course. So I went back to CIA headquarters. It's night and day difference between working in Baghdad and going back to CIA headquarters. I mean, it's just a bureaucracy, a monstrous bureaucracy. And, it was a rough time for me trying to make that transition because, unfortunately, I got myself into a situation where I wasn't the chosen officer to fill that position. It was because one of my former supervisors kind of forced that position on some of the decision makers. So they were trying to get me to pull out of that job. But I managed to stay and complete the training. And after that 7-9 months back at CIA headquarters, deployed back to the field in a country that I cannot name. But in the name, I name it fictitious name Carmenia. And I was basically back in the thick of things, doing a lot of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency operations. In this particular case, working with host country entities, basically targeting the bad guys.
So what went wrong? That sounds like an interesting job.
Well, CIA is a big bureaucracy.
Yeah.
This started one phase of blowing the whistle. Eventually, what happened in that station with me, some of the managers in that station, in order to be a little bit comical, I named them basically Mo, Larry, and Curly.
Yeah.
Because it was just that comical. As a matter of fact, I named the station Potemkin Station. Because, I mean, in contrast to Baghdad Station, this was an amateur division. And I had a stellar work history. By the time I got to this station, I lost track. I mean, 5 exceptional performance awards, 4 of them in Iraq, 1 in the counter drug work. So I got promoted while I was in this country. They wanted me to extend for a 4th year, and eventually they found somebody else that they wanted to put in my position. So they were trying to get me to cancel my 3rd year extension. And when I refused to cancel that, they started cooking up a plot to basically denigrate my character, my work. And essentially, they basically forced me out. But the thing about this is that in this process, I blew the whistle on abuses of authority, gross mismanagement, significant EEO issues. And sadly, I found out the hard way that the Inspector General, the Equal Employment Opportunity, they really don't care. They'll go in like the cleanup crew to cover it all up, sweep it up. And that's what happened in my case. But, I fought in this particular case because I had a pregnant fiance, a daughter yet to be born. And I was fighting for the future of my marriage and my daughter. So I had no choice to stand up to this tyranny. I mean, these were tyrannical tactics that they used to force me out of a job that, sadly, the reality is it cost the CIA hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more than $1 million, to train me and deploy me and keep me there. So, I mean, they were defrauding the government of money just by kicking me out. So one man fighting against the system, forget it. I obviously lost that battle. But I was able to, from there, go to Afghanistan. And I went to Afghanistan in January of 2010, which was right after the Coast suicide bombing attack.
Yes.
And as a counterintelligence referent, it was a critical position I would have in combating additional threats to ensure that our operations would be safe from potential suicide bombers, among other threats. And I managed to do very well in that year in Afghanistan, got great performance appraisals. And I was a DI analyst still on paper, despite having Director of Operations certifications, having done Director of Operations work in Iraq and in this other country named Armenia. So by the time I left Afghanistan in early 2011, I was still a DI analyst looking to transition to Director of Operations. And I managed to land a job with the Information Operations Center doing technical targeting that I began in basically the spring of 2011. And this just takes off and goes a different.
What is technical targeting?
Technical targeting comprises different facets. We were doing basically looking at digital data to look for terrorists, what they were doing online in order to be able to find them so that we can interdict them. I did that countering terrorism in the Middle East, basically the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, the Horn of Africa.
Wow. So how did your opinion of CIA change while you were there? But by this point, do you realize maybe they're not helping the United States?
Well, I realized that when I worked in Baghdad in 2004, 2006, I worked for a lot of the older managers that came in probably the 80s and the 90s. And I noticed that they had a lot of skilled and capable leaders. Some of these were former police officers, former military, former businessmen. They came into the agency with a lot of experience. Post 9/11, fast forward into 2010s, now I'm beginning to work with a lot younger officers who had no life experiences and came fresh out of college. And there were remarkable differences between both generations. And it would all come to a crash and a climax further down the road, post-Afghanistan, post-headquarters, when I went back out to Afghanistan. When I went back out to Afghanistan in 2014, now I find myself as a deputy chief of base, which I am entrusted with a significant position. Our number one priority is keep our officers safe. And in this particular case, we're there to fight a war. I mean, that's what we're doing in Afghanistan. Now I'm working for a new set of managers who, at the base, the chief of base, and for that matter, even some of the lower level managers at the Kabul station, who really were not cut up to the job of being in Afghanistan and fighting these kind of wars. And unfortunately, office politics, vindictiveness, abusing the position for your own gain became a prevalent issue. And in this particular case, I find myself in a very, very hard position. I'm working for a very nice lady who I respected, who had her skills and capabilities, but she was not cut out for this job, couldn't handle the dirt, the grime, the noise, the isolation, the long hours, the rockets landing on top of you, out of nowhere at no time. And we would be basically awakened. There's a rocket, inbound, kaboom, jump off your bed and go find out what's going on. She couldn't handle that. And sadly, one of the most distressing thing for her is, as a mother of three, she felt, like she was neglecting her sons back home.
Well, she was.
Yes, she was. And unfortunately, in this particular case, her motive for being there was to make some extra money to pay for one of her son's colleges, and at the same time to be able to change her retirement plan. At the CIA, if you work 5 years overseas...
That's what she was doing in a war zone?
Yeah. Sadly, I saw this too often. So this goes back to your question as far as good and bad people. It's a bureaucracy first and foremost.
So it's sort of like the DMV with guns then. You're making it sound, I mean, if she, that's not the profile of the CIA operations officer, I imagine.
Well, I remember Afghanistan 2010. I worked for a chief of base, a deputy chief of base. One of these guys was just really gun-ho, tip of the spear. Let's go fight this war. Let's go win. Let's take back the territory. And now I'm working for the Shake and Bake tour, the cooking and baking tour, adopting sons tour. But the worst part about it was we were going out of the base at night for yoga classes at a time of increased rocket attacks.
Yoga class?
Yeah, and on top of that, we were going out of the base during peak times of indirect fire for food without a necessity to do so. And in one of those instances, on the way back, one of the routes we took, 10 minutes later, a rocket impacted right over the site we drove over for food. Eventually, I had to do something about this. I mean, my training, years of having worked in a war zone, 6+ years by the time I've got to Afghanistan, I knew what to do, what not to do. But even more importantly, from CIA headquarters, when they send us out to the field in the war zone, they put us through a very sophisticated, detailed vetting process that includes meeting with every senior leader, and they give us guidance on telling us exactly what to do. So she was doing everything we were told not to do. So I knew she wouldn't get it. She wouldn't understand it. I raised it with a psychological officer, regional psychological officer that came to the base, told him. In reality, he should have done something about it, but he didn't. He basically washed his hands of it and told me, you go talk to your supervisor above her. So eventually I had to talk to him. This individual did not like at all everything I said. Nothing was done about it except potentially tell her. So at that point in time, it kind of soured the relationship, but we were still working together. But the situation eventually just blew up, literally like if a rocket would have landed, with an incident between a younger officer and an older officer. And that's a long story, but the short part of it is the younger officer was treated as an adopted son, spoiled and babied by the chief of base, which created the hostile environment, taking advantage of the older officer, which the chief of base really didn't care for, this older officer. I mean, she basically said, you take care of him. So they had a spat, and I spoke up to her, said, look, this situation has been in the coming for a long time, which I actually warned you about a couple weeks ago. And instead of trying to resolve things locally, I told her we can fix this here in the base. She chose to escalate and take it to Kabul, lying against this older officer, accusing him of having drawn a weapon. So now you've got this other supervisor in Kabul trying to investigate, something that never happened. And the supervisor in Kabul was trying to basically coerce, manipulate me to take punitive actions against this older officer. I couldn't do that. I had to speak the truth. So I spoke the truth. And the next thing I know is I'm the one who is...
This does not sound like a very impressive organization to me. At least you imagine in your mind that the CIA, whatever its purpose is or goal, it's corrupt. Obviously, it's against democracy, but it's at least kind of like they're swashbucklers or something. These sound like Department of Transportation lifers to me.
Well, it gets worse. When they basically... At this point in time, we had a 3-week break. I had to speed up my 3-week break. On my way out, I have a video teleconference with the chief of station, the deputy chief of station, the chief of resources. They're at Kabul, and I go over all these issues. I sent him all the materials, and I sent all the materials to the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer. The last words from the chief of station was, just go home, take your break. We'll sort this all out, and we'll get back to you. I'm back home. Within a week, I'm called, and I'm told, please come to this headquarters on such and such a date at such and such a time. I never got a call from the EO officer except a few hours before I'm supposed to meet at headquarters. I make it to CIA headquarters. I meet with the EO officer. Doesn't want to hear anything about what was happening at that base. He basically said, what EEO issues? Just completely just doesn't want to hear anything. As if he never read my materials or if he basically shredded them. Well, I go to the meeting In the meeting with the senior officers, I'm told I would not be going back to Afghanistan, that I can apply for any job I want. And, well, I went back to see the EO officer. The EO officer had the audacity to tell me, well, it's a good thing you got fired. You can reinvent yourself. Now I'm left outside. I have access to nothing. I couldn't take all the documentation that proved my claims because they were classified. They would have had classified markings. We used, fictitious names. We used operational things for communications. So I had no proof, but I knew exactly where the proof could be found. So the next thing I find myself is trying to find somebody at CIA who would help. And the reality is that nobody wanted to help. They wanted to just cover it up. The first line was EEO useless. I had to contact the Director of National Intelligence and tell them about the situation, their EEO office, and they gave me a number of the grievance officer that handles these things for the Director of Operations. When I finally set up a meeting with him, this guy is like, ooh, this is a hot potato. Let's throw it away. Go talk to the EEO officer, another EEO officer. By that time, I had reached out to the Inspector General. And at that point in time, when I went to the Inspector General in early April, that would have been a whistleblower allegation of reprisal. By law, they were required to, within 14 days, determine whether there was a potential reprisal or not and open an investigation. That required constant collaboration between both of us, where in 90 days they would tell me whether or not they had finished their investigation. If not, they would continue for 60 days until no more than 240 days to complete it. None of that was done. I met once with the IG. They wanted nothing to do with it. They said, this is an EEO issue. And it continues to go downhill. It continues to go worse.
Around this time that you're wrangling with the Inspector General and the EEO office at CIA and all that, do you start to notice a political change at CIA? What were the politics of your fellow officers?
By that time, Brennan had been the director for some time. And John Brennan was a very strong director that brought his people in, imposed his will. And this was CIA in 2015. I mean, by that time, you got to also understand that we're dealing with, look at the politics of the United States. 93 to 2001, you had Clinton as president.
Yes.
So he's putting his people in. Okay. George Bush, president from 2001 to 2009, is just a small fraction of time compared to now having Obama 2009 through 2017. So you're looking at Democratic presidents with Democratic operatives, pretty much getting into these high-level government positions. And I noticed that the Democratic operatives in some cases were much stronger than the Republicans. The Republicans, in my opinion, were very weak leaders. Look at Porter Goss. Porter Goss didn't even last anything. The CIA pretty much kicked him out. Post Brennan, Pompeo came in and he basically just continued Brennan's CIA.
Of course.
And on top of that, he picked Gina Haspel to be his deputy.
Well, I think that probably Mike Pompeo on a deep level agrees with John Brennan on most things.
What I saw, part of it, how my story develops, eventually, with all this fiasco of the IGs, EEO, everything failing me, I would end up blowing the whistle on the broken whistle, hence the title, The Broken Whistle. Because not only is the ability for you as an intelligence community official to blow the whistle broken, it more so is they know it's broken and they don't care that it's broken and they will use the system to crush you.
Yes.
So I had to basically run out of CIA from just the bureaucratic beating and bullying that I took from all these different offices. And I took shelter in the Office of Inspector General for the Intelligence Community in what is known as a Joint Duty Assignment, a JDA. And I'm there and I get put on a team that does basically interagency type evaluations, inspections for the IG. And we start working on an evaluation on whistleblower protections, where we're evaluating the enforcement of Presidential Policy Directive 19, which was put in place by President Obama. And Brennan, Clapper, and every other agency had to certify to the president that they had policies and procedures in place that followed the rules, the laws, the standards to investigate whistleblower reprisals. Well, we find out that, yeah, there's pretty ink on paper. That's about it. I mean, unenforceable. Not only that, the IGs really weren't following the letter of the law. In some cases, didn't have any interest to follow the letter of the law. And in one instance, we had somebody basically just plotting to not even enforce these protections. So the protections that I had as a whistleblower didn't exist. And it's just not me alone. I mean, there were others around my same time that had blown the whistle on the broken whistle and on other matters, and they received reprisals. I write about them in my book, John Reedy, Daniel P. Meyer, Andrew Bakage, Jonathan Kaplan. Some of their stories are in the book. The point is, I had to blow the whistle on the broken whistle. So I escalated after I got sent back to CIA. When I went back to CIA, basically the IG kicked me out. They said it was a conflict of interest for me to work for them, work on a whistleblower evaluation when I was a whistleblower alleging reprisal when an attorney filed a lawsuit. Mind you, there were other whistleblowers inside the IG at the time. So I go back to CIA. And at that point in time, I literally landed back at CIA 2 years to the date when I first went back from Afghanistan. It's like if I was going back into the pit of hell, as I call it, for round 2 with the devils. And they would turn into round 3 with the devils, because I went back and endured the same exact thing, but actually worse. At this point in time, I took it to the IG himself, Wayne Stone, the acting IG for the ICIG. I used the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act procedure to report a lot of these issues as far as what I went through in Afghanistan, about the whistle being broken, and other matters. And they did nothing with my disclosures. I'm getting nowhere, not finding any jobs. I was basically blackballed. Jobs were being re-advertised I was qualified to do. I was applying for them. They wouldn't even tell me no. I was basically left to fend for myself.
But were you still a federal employee at this point?
I was still a federal employee working for the CIA. I had a temporary job, but I had to find a permanent job, and that required me apply for these jobs and interview for some of these jobs. And without getting too down in the weeds, basically the process was stacked against me, because you have to essentially try to find jobs that are within your career service or that are career enhancing for them to be able to potentially offer you these jobs. And I was applying for jobs I was well qualified to do, had proven I can do, and were actually within my career field. And they were still telling me no and re-advertising them. So getting nowhere, I blow the whistle to Mike Pompeo's number 3, his hand-picked Chief Operations Officer, Brian Bulatao. At that point in time, immediately, they issue an anti-harassment policy, sent out an email, and they tell me basically, go talk to the IG. The IG is investigating. We want nothing to do with this. Let the IG do their job. So basically, Mike Pompeo and his number 3 washed their hands of it and let the bureaucracy handle this.
So you're working at CIA during the Trump election. What was the view of that within the CIA? What do people think of Trump at CIA?
Well, at that time, I was actually at the Office of Inspector General for the Intelligence Community.
Yes.
What I found interesting was that we were in a satellite building. That every government building usually has the picture of the president, the vice president. In this particular case, I don't know how many months it took them to eventually put the picture of the president and the vice president up on the wall, as if they didn't even want to recognize him as the president or the vice president. It could be that there was no official portrait for the president or vice president, but regardless, they should have immediately tried to put a picture up there.
Did you ever hear people talk about Trump or the election when you worked at CIA?
Some employees liked him, some didn't like him. It was depending on who we're talking about.
Right.
I mean, to a degree, the problem that we have with CIA is the headquarters side. CIA has overseas, obviously, as everybody knows. But the majority of the officers work in the Washington, D.C. area, And in that Washington, D.C. area, going back to the politics of, all the Democratic administration has become predominantly liberal. You can look at the voting records for Fairfax County, Arlington County, Loudoun County. And you'll notice that, up until about 2008, those counties were predominantly red, very Republican. Then all of a sudden they turn into blue, very Democratic. Same reflection with CIA. A lot of these younger people coming in have been more liberal, more democratically inclined. So a lot of people didn't like Trump. I mean, it got so bad in one of my offices that one of the leaders actually spoke out and said, look, we have to respect the chain of command. If you find yourself mentally distressed because Trump won the presidency, go seek some psychological help. That actually did happen.
Why did that supervisor have to say that?
Because as federal employees...
Oh, I understand why legally he had to say that.
We work for the president.
Of course, you
Yes.
have to, right?
And, whether we agree with the president or not, we're there to basically serve the president.
But were people at the office, the Intel office, getting hysterical about Trump? Is that why?
I think that some of their emotions were flared up. And
Did you see any of that?
I personally did not witness any of that.
Yeah.
But apparently some people were really just very upset about it.
So looking back, and now that we know that the CIA had a big role in the 2020 election, trying to hide information from voters, etc., does that surprise you?
Given that the history of the Democratic Party and their operatives like Brennan and so forth, not at all.
But that's illegal. They're not allowed to do that.
It's illegal, but this goes to a core and key critical issue. They just can't handle power. The amount of power that you can have in some of these secretive agencies is so much that some people just can't handle it. And it basically corrupts them. It gets to the point that they almost lose their conscience. I mean, when you've got so much power that you can just upend somebody's life, you have got to find a balance to be able to keep your conscience. And I have found officers or senior leaders who basically have become so desensitized through the years that it's almost as if they lose their conscience and they can no longer see right or wrong. And it's like it's my way or the highway.
So you saw that.
Yeah.
What kind of power does the CIA have? What power are you talking about?
Well, fighting a war, life and death decisions, technical targeting. I had to get it right or somebody could have a real bad day.
This is technical targeting of people who are going to be killed.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially. We're talking about, we're doing counterterrorism operations. We're doing things that, death and life situations at hand. On top of that, the personnel matters. They're like any organization, metrics becomes a problem. When you start getting focused on the wrong metrics,
yes,
you could end up sacrificing your conscience, your morals, your ethics. It's like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing something? Are we trying just to pad the numbers like we have X amount of intelligence reports, we have X amount of operations? What are we doing? Because if you're just trying to do activity so you can create a metric, you potentially could put lives in danger. In Afghanistan, there were a lot of operations out there being done. Some of it driven by metrics, some of it driven by threats, like, it's a legitimate operation, a legitimate target, there's something that needs to be done. Or in some cases, somebody just wants to create a metric just to pad the numbers.
Yes.
Sadly, it does happen everywhere. But in the case of national security or where lives are at stake, you got to find the right balance. It's like, wait a moment, stop. This is not about metrics. This is about human lives.
You don't want to kill people just to reach a target.
Or, collateral damage personnel resources at the CIA.
Did you ever, to your point, which is such an interesting and wise one, I think, but that power corrupts, of course. But did you ever hear anybody say, maybe we shouldn't be killing this person, or I feel bad about killing that person? Did you ever hear that?
One time I was working in one office and somebody walked in, hey, did we kill somebody today? Some people just can't handle this kind of stuff.
How did the person say it? Like,
literally just laughing.
Laughing.
Yeah.
You shouldn't laugh about killing people, though, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, absolutely not. I mean, if we're doing something that means life or death, whether employees, I mean, let's go back to Coast for a moment. What happened in Coast? They put a woman in Coast who did not have the operational experiences to handle that base or what they were doing. And this is all out in written in books and newspaper articles. Her father-in-law opposed her going out there. This is clearly documented. Her motive for being out there was to get her 5 years overseas so she can change her, basically, pension plan. Wrong motive again. And in the process of being in charge of that base, some decisions were made that in order to protect her, because she can't answer for her actions and she's dead, they basically didn't fault necessarily anybody, and they kind of just passed the blame throughout different actors. But part of it was the actual decision made on that day of allowing an unvetted contact who was not a source, who had never been really met by U.S. intelligence, to go into the base to a welcoming committee.
And that person was the suicide bomber.
That's a suicide bomber. So
the woman who made that decision shouldn't have been in a position of authority in the first place.
Not that specific position.
Yeah. How many died, do you remember, in that bombing?
7, counting her, and some additional people were also injured. But that was a fatal mistake through just, we're getting into basically metrics, DEI, and, office politics, which sadly happens at CIA like any other organization.
Did you see DEI at work when you were there?
Absolutely. I mean, look at this woman. The other woman at the chief of base where I was working at. I mean, they're trying to put a woman in a position just to have a woman. I'm not against women having positions. As a matter of fact, I work with a lot of women managers at CIA who were phenomenal. Some of them actually in operations. When I was in Iraq, we had a stellar woman doing some base management out in one of the bases, and she was outstanding. And she rose up the ranks and became a leader at the CIA. So yes, by all means, there are qualified women. But just to find someone, whether a woman or a man, well, in the case of this other station I call Potemkin Station in this country named Carmenia in the book, I mean, Mo, Larry, Curly, the same thing applied with men. We had basically men put in position that were not the best qualified for those positions and actually caused a lot of problems in that station.
Why were they put there?
Office politics. Basically they know somebody, and somebody who knows them, puts them in that position.
It doesn't sound like a meritocracy at all.
It's a lot of nepotism. It's who you know. It happens in every organization, but when we're talking about CIA and Death and Life Matters, employees' lives like Coast, or, the lives of potentially who, could potentially run into problems with whatever, is done, you got to make sure you have capable leaders.
So let me just end with a question that you probably can answer. What do you do about it? How do you, CIA has all this power, you've said its budget is secret, its activities are heavily secret, not all, but a lot are secret. They have all this power. It's clearly not helping the United States in the ways that it should be. How do you fix it?
Well, go back to the Church Pike committees.
Yes.
The Rockefeller Commission. The reality is that what we're seeing today is not new. This happened in the 50s and the 60s,
yes,
and the 70s. What changed was the oversight mechanisms that were put in place. House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence, Senate Select Committee of Intelligence. When these commissions were doing oversight, the CIA and a lot of abuses were reined in. But what has happened through time is these two committees have failed to do their due diligence and do oversight. It's almost as if they work for the CIA and basically do the CIA's bidding. As I found out as a whistleblower, don't you dare go to Congress and blow the whistle, because the reality is they're not there to defend you. They're there to defend the CIA and cover up for the CIA, which is what I have encountered. So how do we fix this? We may need another church committee, and we may need somehow to redo some of our intelligence agencies. Potentially, certainly one thing that needs to be done is top-down review. what we're doing, what we're not doing, what should be done, what should not be done. Where is there redundancy? Where are we failing in personnel matters? Where are we failing in following metrics instead of really activities we should be following? And funding.
But I wonder, I agree with all of that, but I wonder if Congress can't even force CIA to release the Kennedy assassination documents 61 years later, which they have not. Thousands of documents they're still holding. Congress has not been able to do anything about that in 60 years. So maybe CIA is so much more powerful than Congress that a congressional hearing or committee won't make a difference.
Well, the reality is you're right. CIA and many executive branch governments are actually even stronger than the president himself. Many times, these agencies will obstruct presidential policies, or for that matter, don't even disclose everything to presidents. So we go back to your point. What do we do here? We are going to have to do a top-down review, another church-like committee with power, and we're going to need outsiders, like has been done in the past with other committees. Potentially get some high-profile lawyers like Alan Dershowitz, Jonathan Turley, entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, or so forth. Do a real deep dive, and Congress is going to have to commit to follow those directives that are issued.
Do you think members of Congress committee chairmen are being blackmailed by CIA?
Well, actually, there's one way they do blackmail. Security clearances. Who issues security clearances for a lot of these staffers? You know, the congressmen, senators, House of Representatives, they have a clearance. But if you're a staffer, your clearance at times will run through CIA, NSA, NGA, so forth, yep. DIA. Although Office of Personnel Management does the security clearance, they get input from these other three-letter agencies. So they can literally stop anyone from having a clearance if they want to. So that's one means and one way that they can actually control Congress.
So if you're a senator, but your staff can't get clearances, then really you don't have the time to read all this stuff.
You know who does the work at Congress?
Yes,
it's the staffers.
Of course.
Staffers. I mean, a lot of these senators and these House of Representative members do very little work. They're basically dependent upon their staffers to do all their research and their bidding for them. All the bills, really, to a degree, are written by all these staffers. Yeah. So if the security clearance of these staffers is controlled by the CIA, the intelligence community, they certainly can manipulate Congress members to ensure that only select people get those clearances.
And they do that.
And they do.
I mean, if members of the intel community are breaking federal law to spy on Americans without a warrant, and why is no one ever held accountable for that?
The oversight mechanism is Congress. And if they fail to do something about it, they will get away with it. And then we get into a vicious cycle where, oh, I got away with doing this, doing that, breaking this law. So they continue doing it. And it just continues to spiral downward to a point where it can become more graver, the infractions even larger. And what happens, there's another dimension to it, is the ability of people to speak up is completely diminished, spiral of silence, because the cost of speaking up is too high.
Yes.
Where, I mean, look at the case of Drake and Snowden. Drake blew the whistle using the disclosure mechanisms in place, and they came after him, accused him of leaking national security data, and actually tried to prosecute him. He pled guilty to some minor things, but they basically tore his life apart. Snowden comes in, and he essentially makes similar like disclosures publicly because he knew the system would crush him. He could not trust this system at all. And the point here is...
You worked there when Snowden did that.
Yes.
What was the reaction internally?
Internally, there was... significant damage to national security was done from the perspective of some of these collection programs. Some of these collection programs are actually good for our benefit when we use them right to target, terrorists and adversaries. But when people can't handle the power given to them and start abusing these powers to target political adversaries, now you got a problem. But this gets to another point too. How do we get here? Well, post 9/11, we gave these agencies vast powers. And what has happened is they have flipped the switch on these vast powers to use them against political adversaries.
Yes.
through the predicate of counterintelligence or counterterrorism authorities. If, for example, you or I were seen as a potential Russian asset of some type, they can turn these authorities against us on the flip of a switch legally to begin to investigate us and eavesdrop on us. And that's no secret. That information is out there, and that's how it's done.
Amazing. Amazing. I appreciate your spending all this time and telling us what it's like to actually work there. The Broken Whistle, a deep state run amok. Pedro Israel Orta, thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
Appreciate
God bless you.
God bless.